Welcome. In this lecture, we will talk about flower, the four whorls of the flower, which are extremely important to study. Now, before we begin with, some of the flowers have a stalk. Now, this stalk is known as pedicel, and these flowers which have the pedicel are known as peduncle flowers or pedicellate flowers. In case there is no pedicel which is present, those flowers are called as sessile flowers. Sometimes with the pedicel, there are two small leaf-type green structures. They are known as bract or bracteoles. I am not talking about the sepals. Note, below the sepals, there are two small leaf-like structure on the pedicel. These are called as bract or bracteoles. However, they are green in color, but in case of bougainvillea, they are colored. So the idea is to attract insects for pollination. Even the bracts and the bracteoles have the same function. Now, at the base of the pistil or the petal, there are nectaries. Now, nectaries are again having the same function to attract the insects for the pollination. Nectaries is a good example of a plant where nectaries are present. Now, the lower broad part is known as thalamus. Now, this part is known as thalamus. This thalamus is also known as receptacle. So, thalamus or receptacle is another important part. This is the part where nodes and internodes get condensed. Now coming on to the four important, the common whorls of the flower which you have been studying from the lower classes. A quick recap and an understanding of those. The first whorl is what is known as calyx. This is what is the sepal. It is green in color in most of the cases. Sometimes it is colorful in nature. The next is corolla. Corolla is what is known as petals. They are colorful. The idea is to attract insects for pollination. The next is the male whorl, which is known as Androecium. The next is the female whorl, the innermost, which is known as Gynoecium. The Androecium has stamens and Gynoecium has the ovary. Among these, calyx and corolla are called as non-essential whorls. Even if they are not present, they are not important. So, they are called as non-essential, or they are also called as accessory whorl. The male and the female whorls, which is Androecium and Gynoecium, are known as the essential whorl of the plant. Now, if all the whorls are present, we call it as a complete flower. If any one of the whorl is not present, we call it as an incomplete flower. So, what is complete flower? What is incomplete flower? What are essential whorls? What is non-essential or accessory whorl? All of this gets clear here. Now, we'll come on to some important terminologies that you must be familiar with. If either the male or the female whorl is present, we call this as an imperfect flower. This imperfect flower is also known as unisexual flower. Examples of imperfect flower would be papaya, palm, loofah. If both male and female whorl are present, we call it as a perfect flower, or we also call it as a bisexual flower. Now, bisexual flower, good example would be China rose, mustard, petunia. Mustard is a very good example to explain it. The flower of mustard is a classic example. China rose flower, again one of the most common examples in lab you would see. And petunia. The examples in this case are extremely important. There could be direct questions asking about which of a flower is an example of perfect flower, imperfect flower. To repeat again, imperfect flower examples are papaya, palm, loofah. Perfect flower examples are mustard, China rose, petunia. Now, the imperfect flower, which is the unisexual flower, if it has only the part of Androecium which is present, it is known as staminate because it has Androecium or the stamens, as simple as that. So, from stamens you can remember it as staminate. The next is The unisexual flower which only has the pistil or the gynoecium, as it has pistil, it is called as pistillate. If, again very important, understand this carefully, if the stamens are not functional, they are known as staminodes. If the pistil is not functional, it is known as pistillode. So pistillate flower is a flower which is an imperfect flower which has only the gynoecium, but if the gynoecium is non-functional, it is known as pistillode. If it is an imperfect flower with only stamen, it is known as a staminate, but if that stamen is non-functional, it is known as staminode. So whenever it comes as ode, ODE, that means it is non-functional. Another important thing. If both Androecium and Gynoecium are not present in the flower, it has only the calyx and corolla, such flower are called as neuter flower. So that is neuter flower, another important terms. So these terms very, very important. Examples for the related term, again very important. Now, if there is a flower, I can have various ways into which I cut a flower. If the flower is symmetrical, I can cut it into two halves from any of the ways. This is called as actinomorphic flower. Actinomorphic means it is perfectly symmetrical. I can cut it into two halves from any plane. Good example would be rose, tulip, poppy. They are called also as radial symmetry flowers. The next is zygomorphic. Zygomorphic means I can cut it into two halves but only from one plane. So if it is circular, I can cut it from any plane. So it is actinomorphic, or we call it as radial. Zygonomorphic, let's say this is the shape, I can cut it into two halves only from one plane. Okay, so we call this as zygomorphic. Now zygomorphic, a good example is sweet pea. So how do we have the pea bean? We can cut it into two halves only from one axis. Okay, the flower of it. So sweet pea is an example of zygomorphic. Beans, again bean flower, again an example of zygomorphic. The last one is asymmetrical flower. That means in none of the axes it could be cut into two equal halves. Good example is canna. So those are some of the important terms. What is actinomorphic? What is zygomorphic? What is asymmetrical? What is staminate and what is staminoid? Pistillate and pistilloid. Neuter flower, imperfect flower, perfect flower. Coming on next to the four whorls. We'll talk about each of these whorls one by one. The first is calyx, the outermost, which is known as sepal. As we said, it is green in color, so it has the function of preparing the food through photosynthesis. But in some cases, these sepals are colored. Gulmohar is a good example where the sepals, the outermost whorl, is colorful, and the idea is to attract the flowers for pollination. Nectaries is another example where sepals are colored, and Nectaries is another example where we said that nectarines are present. Nectaries are present, right? Now, if the sepals are free, each sepal is separate, we call it as polysepalous. Poly means free. That's something you must remember, because we would move to petals, we would have polypetalous. So free sepals, free petals, that means they are poly. We call them as poly. Good example of polysepalous is mustard, radish. Again, examples extremely important in biology. You would have a simple question, mustard, whether it is polysepalous, it is gamosepalous, you have to answer that. So polysepalous means the sepals, the outermost whorls are free. Gamosepalous, gamo means they are united. So the whole green whorl on the lower base would be united into one. We call it as gamosepalous. In the case of China rose, it is gamosepalous. Sometimes besides the calyx, there is an additional layer which is present, as in the case of hibiscus. We call this as epicalyx. So it is beyond the calyx, there is one more layer. We call this as epicalyx. So epicalyx is again important. Hibiscus is a good example. Now, sometimes calyx always remain. So persistent, as we say, you always study, you are persistently studying. So persistent, the word means always. So if the calyx remains always, it is called as a persistent calyx. Brinjal, peas, guava are examples where persistent calyx is seen. The other form of calyx is deciduous. That means as the fruit forms or the petals fall off, the sepals would also go away. And the example of this is brassica. So brassica, we have deciduous calyx or deciduous outermost whorl, the deciduous sepals which are seen. The next is corolla. Corolla is also known as petals. Colorful, the idea is to attract insects for pollination and to protect the inner whorls, which is the male whorl and the female whorl, the Androecium and the Gynoecium. In certain cases, these petals may be green. If the petals are green, they are known as sepaloids. If the petals are green, they are known as sepaloids. The terms are extremely important, don't get confused. Sepaloid is when petals are green in color. So petals of the color of sepals, and therefore they are called as sepaloids. Now again, polypetalous. So poly, as we saw before, they are free petals. Again, mustard is an example where we have polypetalous. Rose is an example where each petal is separate. So if you see the flower, you will remember it. So it's polypetalous. Gamopetalous. Petunia, the tura, where they are fused. So all the petals are fused into one bell-shaped structure. This is known as gamopetalous. The next is the third whorl. The third whorl is the male whorl, which is the Androecium. Now Androecium has the stamen. Now this is called as a stamen. Stamen has three segments: filament, connective and anther. Filament is the stack on which the anther lies, and anther is where the pollen sacs are. Now the most important thing is connective. Connective is the part which joins the two lobes of the anther, and then is anther. As I said, the two lobes of the anther. So how many lobes? Two lobes. That's one thing that we have understood. Now each of the lobe would have two pollen sacs. So in all, 4 pollen sacs are present, and in these pollen sacs are the pollen grains. These pollen grains go to the stigma, stick to the stigma, through the stigma move from the style to the ovary, and this is how the reproduction cycle of a flower completes. So within the male Androecium, there is 3 important components: filament, connective and anther. Together, this is known as stamen. Okay. This is again important to understand that this stamen can be of various types. We will understand few important terms. Monoadelphous. Monoadelphous means all the filaments of the third whorl are united to form a single tube. This is an example of China rose. The next is diadelphous. Diadelphous is where all the filaments are united not into one, but they are united into 2 different bundles. When they are united into 2 different bundles, the filaments are united into 2 different bundles, but the anthers on the top would remain free for each of those. On the bottom, they are one tube. So 2 tubes. One tube in the case of monoadelphous, 2 tubes in the case of diadelphous. Monoadelphous, good example, China rose. Diadelphous, good example, pea and sesbania. The next is polyadelphous. Polyadelphous is where filaments unite into many bundles. poly. So it's not just one, it is many bundles, and the anthers are free again. So mono, di and polyadelphous. So in the case of sepals and petals, poly meant each of them is free. Here again poly means many, so each of them are technically free. So you can remember it as free only. So polyadelphous means each of the filament are actually free. There are many filaments and the anthers are also free. This example is silk, cotton, castor. Three important examples for polyadelphous: silk, cotton, two from which we get the textile, so silk and cotton, and then castor from which we get the oil, so castor oil. Good examples to remember. The next is syngenous. Now syngenesis means the filaments are free, but on the top the anthers are one. So each of the filament is free, but the anthers are united into one bundle. Good example is syngenous, so sunflower. That's how you can remember it. The next is synandrous. Synandrous means both the filament as well as the anther are one. So it's united from the filament, it is united from the anther as well. We call it as synandrous. Good example is gourd. So that is a basic classification. The types of stamen, very important. I repeat again. Monoadelphous, that means there is a single filament, anthers are free. China rose is an example. Diadelphous, two filaments, anthers are again free. P. sesbania are good example. The next is polyadelphous, that means filaments are many, anthers are many. Silk, cotton, castor are good examples for the same. The next is syngenerous, that means filaments are free, anthers are one. In the case of sunflower, and then synandrous, where filaments and anthers, all of them are one bundle, and this bundle is a gourd. The next is Gynoecium. Now, Gynoecium are also called as pistil or the innermost whorl. It is the innermost, that means the most protected whorl, and this lies into the center of the thalamus with one or more carpels that could be present. Now, the structure of the carpel has stigma on the top where the pollen grains from the anther would stick, move through the style, get into the ovary. Now, ovary is what forms the fruit and ovule is what forms the seeds, right? Another important thing is the stigma has a terminal knob, and this could be either sticky or feathery. Either case, the idea is to receive the pollen grains and transfer it to the ovary, which is the base. Now, ovary can have various chambers. These chambers of the ovary are called as chambers or locules. If it is one, it is called as unilocular. If it has many, it is called as multilocular. So, ovary could be unilocular or multilocular. Now, as we had seen for the case of stamen, it was monoadelphous, diadelphous, polyadelphous. The same works for the case of carpels. So, we call it as monocarpellary, which means a single carpel which is present. Beans, pea flower is an example of monocarpellary. Bicarpellary, that means two carpels. Mustard is a example for the same. Polycarpellary, that means many carpels. Ladyfinger is an example for the same. If the carpels are free, they are called as apocarpus. The example for apocarpus is rose. If the carpels are united or fused, we call it as syncarpus. Syncarpus, an example is mustard, China rose. So those are good example for syncarpus. So mono means one, bi means two, poly means many. Mono, the example is beans and peas. Bi, the example is mustard. Poly example is ladyfinger. Apocarpus means when the carpels are free, we call it as apocarpus. So example is rose. Syncarpus, where the carpels are fused. China rose, mustard are example of syncarpus. Now besides this, two important terms that you must be familiar with is, one is inflorescence. Inflorescence means the arrangement of the flower on the axis is called as inflorescence. Now the types of inflorescence we have covered in a separate lecture, so you can refer that for more detail. And the next is placentation. Now placentation is the part of the ovule to which the ovary is attached in the placenta. The arrangement of the placentation is again different. So that is again covered in a separate lecture. So those are some of the important things. The major takeaway from this lecture is the classification and the examples for each of those. So what is monocarpellary? What is monoadelphous? So monoadelphous is a term used for third whorl. Monocarpellary is a term used for fourth whorl. Then the examples in each of those. So what you can do is, for a quick and easy recap what we have done, you can create a simple table for it and mark the names along with their examples, because in most of the multiple choice questions, fill in the blanks question, one line questions, these are the kind of things which would be asked if you have good command over it. And another good example is to see certain flowers, visualize those carefully so that the things automatically are saved and you are able to answer the questions readily. So that was about this lecture. Hope you enjoyed. Wish you very good luck. Thanks for joining in.